Alright, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. Going through a series of video presentations for the Rankin Technical College Application and Web Development, AWD1111.NET Framework with Web Databases class. The textbook for the class is ASP.NET MVC with Entity Framework and CSS by Naylor. We are up to Chapter 11, so far I have done lectures on the first 10 chapters and also on chapters 14 through 18. So I've got 11, 12, and 13 to go. Alright, the Chapter 11 is entitled Using Entity Framework Code First with an Existing Database. So far, all of the examples in this book have been based on a project started from scratch with a new database. However, in reality, according to the author, this is rare. Entity Framework version 6.1 and then forward now has a feature that supports code-first approach with an existing database. It says there are no prereqs for completing this chapter. It does not require any source code downloads or anything from the previous chapter. So, to create a database, there are various approaches you can take with Visual Studio. The author will show you how to create one using the SQL Server Object Explorer in Visual Studio. You'll create a simple database with products and categories similar to the ones at the beginning of the book. First, they want us to close any existing solutions. So again, I'm going to literally, as we have been doing here, just come in here and I've got the one open already from Chapter 11. So close any existing solutions and open the SQL Server Object Explorer from the View menu. You've seen this before, so again I can come in here. It's open already, but let's assume it was not. So View, Server Explorer, right there. Okay. Next, open your local version of SQL Server and locate the database folder. Right-click on this folder and choose Add New Database as is shown right here. All right, good morning. So we can go and bring this up. We can click right here. All right, on either one of these. Now, it says here that we are supposed to choose SQL Server databases. So we can create a new SQL Server database right there. All right. When you bring that up as it's shown right there, okay, in the Create New Database window, it says you can add a new database named Code First from Existing DB and leave the location as the default. This will store the database under your current user folder in Windows. Let's see if we can give that a ride. Says this server version is not supported. Only servers up to SQL Server 2014 are supported. Well, let's continue on. The design window will now appear in Visual Studio. They want you to change the name of the table to categories. So this will just probably say table to begin with. All right, and then just add a very simple table with an ID and a name. All right. Finally, we want the primary key to be auto-generated, so we want to go down into our properties, choose the isIdentity, make it true. All right. And then click on the Update button. Next, create a product table, and they show you how to do that. So it's going to look basically like this, and they add a new foreign key. What I want to do, though, is I want to take a second, and I want to show you something as I was looking online. Now, think about this. This really should make sense, hopefully at least to everybody, and that is code first versus database first. When you do code first, you go in and you create your models, and you have your classes, and you create a class basically for each one of the tables that you're going to put in your database. You set up a DB context, etc. So you literally, as it says, write the code first. And you, for lack of better words, kind of let the Entity Framework and Visual Studio build the database for you. All right, with database first, you build the database, and then you build the models based around the tables you've already created for the database. So this person asked, they said, I'm doing this, I want to understand the differences between the two. I thought this wasn't bad. All right, so code first. Very popular because hardcore programmers don't like any kind of designers defining and mapping their EDMX.XML because it's too complex. Well, this is the big one. When you do code first, you've got total control over the code. In other words, there is no automatically generated code, which you may have to go through and pick out what you don't want, etc. The general expectation is that you do not bother with DB, which is just storage with no logic. The Entity Framework will handle the creation, and you don't want to know how it does its job. Well, there's actually, I think, more to it than that. And that is, at least on occasion, you're going to find developers who have little to no database experience. So doing the code first will allow the software basically to come in and create the database for you. All right. Now, on the other hand, with database first, very popular if you already have a database designed by a database administrator, developed separately, or you have an existing database. You will let the Entity Framework create entities for you before and after modification, and you will generate the plain old CLR, POCO entities. If you want additional features in POCO entities, you must either modify the template or use partial classes. All right. With model first, you come in there with your EDMX model, and as it says, you draw the model and you base it off of that. Now, let's try to summarize that. When you do code first, quite often people who do code first in here, you're going to find are developers who have little database experience, knowledge, etc. When you do the database first, you're either going to have developers who have experience developing databases, or they already have a developed database that's been developed by someone else. All right. I'm not sure why this did not work for me, but it did not work. Let's jump up to page 413. Where they talk about setting up a new project and generating a code first model from the database. So it says we're going to create a new project that's called Code First from Existing DB Database. Now that's the one I've got up already. create a new ASP.NET web application called Code First Existing Database with the options shown. So we've got this. We've got ASP.NET web application. There's the title, where you're going to save it, etc. Click the OK button. In the next window, choose the ASP.NET 4.6.1 MVC template with the authentication type set to individual user accounts to be consistent with what we did with the baby store. So the options to select, again, MVC and individual user accounts. Once this is done, right-click on the project in the Solution Explorer and choose to add a new item. Okay? When you do that, go under Data, all right, not under Web where we were, but under Data, and choose ADO.NET Data Entity Data Model and call it Store Context. Click the Add button, and then in the Entity Data Model Wizard, choose the Code First from Database. We chose this before. All right? So think about what these do. This says Entity Framework Designer from Database. So this assumes the one that I just put in here in blue, that you've already got the database. All right? This will allow you to start with an empty model and kind of create your own. This will be empty code first, and this says that you have a database, so you basically want to code first from the database. Notice creates a code first model based on an existing database. You can choose the connections, the settings, and the database objects to include in here. So it says click the new connection button. Now in the Connection Properties window, set the server name to your local server existence. All right. Then in the Connect to Database section, choose the Select option and choose that database. Again, you've got your choice of Windows authentication or SQL authentication. Click the OK button, then accept the options and click the Next button. So in here it's asking what tables do you want to be able to bring in this example. Typically, you'll choose all of them, and if you have views, etc., you bring those in as well. So you accept the defaults. All right. Now, we are going to do some of this stuff in here. What I should do, and I'll try to remember to do that soon, is to create some kind of a beginning lecture. Then I put this off times in the lessons and on the videos. It's called Read Me First. It kind of is going to give an overview of what we're going to be doing. All right. So click the Finish button. Visual Studio then auto-generates the relevant code. It says the new Store Context class should appear in the window as shown. The context class contains 2 DB set entries, so right here. One for categories, one for products, very similar to what we did with a database, with a baby store application. As it says, the onModel creating method is used for anything that cannot be modeled using attributes. The project also contains 2 new class files, one for category, one for products, representing the product and category entities and mapping to those tables. These classes are contained in the root of the project rather than in the models folder. You can move them into the models folder and change their namespaces if you so desire. So here's the category. As it says here, the class contains properties for each database field and is similar to the one we hand created with the baby store product. It also contains an extra creation of a hash set in an auto-generated constructor and some attributes related to diagnostic code analysis, which the author is going to talk about. All right, and here's the product, which is done in a similar type of method. So, as mentioned here on the bottom of page 420, this class contains properties for each database field and a virtual property representing the relationship to the category entity right here. We now have a data model representing the database, which we can use in the entity framework code first, the same way we did it in the database baby store product. Now I'm going to keep going. I'm at 16 minutes, but I have literally the equivalent of about 5 pages to go, so I'm going to finish this up. To prove everything works as expected, we'll set up a new controller and some views by using scaffolding. Build the solution, and then right-click on the controllers folder, choose Add Controller, add a new MVC5 controller with views, using Entity Framework, set the model class to product, the data context to store context, and click Add. So it should look like this. All right, so we're on page 421. Visual Studio, after we do all this, will create a products controller class, which will automatically have index and CRUD methods, all right, because of the type of controller that we're using in here. It will also create a set of views under the Views Products folder. If we go and do this and then basically run it, again, it has CRUD capability for us. Now, as you probably guessed, this is assuming that we have data in there already. So here's our products index, and you've seen this kind of thing before, where we can go in and edit existing records, find the details of an existing record, delete an existing record, etc. So as mentioned here, towards the middle of page 422, the products index page showing the data from the products table. All right. Updating the database using code first migration on 422, and really I believe, yep, that's pretty much it for the rest of the chapter. So the author says here, there's going to come a point when you will want to update your existing database model from your code. We've seen earlier in the book that the way to do this is via the use of migrations. However, using code first with an existing database requires extra care to work correctly. First, you must enable migrations for the project. So in your package management console, you want to do this. As mentioned, this will automatically for you create a migrations folder, and it'll add a configuration.cs file to it. Next, we want to create our migrations to run. As mentioned here down below the line in blue, this is where you need to add an extra step for an existing database. If we create a migration now, it will attempt to add all our entities to the database. This will not work because the product and categories tables already exist. So we need to create an initial blank migration, and then later we'll be able to add a migration for any new changes. So this initial blank migration needs the add migration with the initial create. It also, as you can see there, has a flag that says -ignore changes, which ensures that the migration is created and does basically nothing. It'll add an entry to the migrations table. In other words, it'll take a snapshot of what we had originally. All right. Next, we want to run the update database command in order to update the existing database with the initial migration. A new migrations table will now have been created for the code first from existing DB database. Following this, we are to add a new property named description to the product class right here. Then we add a new migration for this. always it's a good idea. I mean, these are user-defined names, but it's always a good idea when you're creating a migration to have it, because again, it's building a table, all right? It's keeping track of this stuff to come up with names that are reflective of what it is you're trying to do. So we add this, a new file will be produced in the migration folder, which will include the code to add a description column. All right. Now, as it says on page 424, now run the update database command in the package manager console. Again, if you go back and you look at the products table, you should see that that field has been added. Next, add some test data. Remember, the description by default, since you added it as an afterthought, so to speak, would not have any data in it. Kind of important that when you do that, you notice that it is set to no. Because, again, you would want that because, as I just mentioned, what you're doing is you're adding a new field to an existing database table. All right, so add some test data. Next, modify the index file to add the description. So you want to make sure if you don't put this in, if you don't manually add this, it won't be displaying that information for you. There was the header. Here's the data. And finally, you see it now right here. Okay. All right. As mentioned, you can now work with your existing database as if you created it using code first and continue to update it using code first if or as required. So, not much that I added probably to this particular chapter. But next I'm going to go through and go through Chapter 12, which is an introduction to ASP.NET Core version 1.0. All right? So we'll be back with that shortly.